Jesus wept is both the shortest and perhaps one of the most discussed verses in the Bible that I know. The idea that Jesus felt deeply isn't all that foreign in Scripture. We can insinuate anger whenever he's overturning the tables, the money changers, sadness whenever John is killed, exhaustion time and again as he goes away to re-energize. But here we see Jesus move to an action that's recorded here simply as 2 words. But it's also recorded when he knows full well that he's about to undo the thing that we assume that he's crying over. But is he crying over what we think he is? Let's spend some time today looking at John chapter 11. The moment that Jesus wept is a meaningful one in the story of Jesus. It comes at the loss of his friend Lazarus. We can't learn too much about Lazarus through Scripture. He doesn't show up in the other stories about Jesus' friends Mary and Martha. And even here, any words he speaks after being raised from the dead aren't recorded. What we can learn about him mostly comes through the words and emotional responses of his sisters and his friends. "Lord, the one you love is sick," said Martha and Mary in the message that they send to Jesus. The message is urgent, but Jesus' response doesn't carry the same urgency. Yet, here we are, and Jesus seems equally troubled when he hears that his friend has died. As everyone watches, tears fall from his face. One of the human conditions that leads to loneliness is an awareness and examination of the horrible things that happen in our world. Why does God not prevent horrible stuff from happening? It's both a theoretical and a personal question. The theoretical angle is called theodicy and leads to both good and not so good answers from people in all walks of life. Yet, it's one thing to hear about injustice in the world or pain in the world, but it's altogether different whenever we are asking, why did my marriage fall apart? Why did they die? Why can't I pay my bills even though I'm working 2 jobs? Why me? The personal question is a very different question than why evil. And this moment with Jesus is a bit of a why me moment. Not only because his friend has died, but also because of the way his other friends respond to him. Martha is the first to reach Jesus when she heard he was coming, and she takes a view that many of us do in the midst of sickness and death. One that Jesus even echoes before his own arrest. Not your will, not my will, but yours. She names Jesus' power and connection to God, but I can still hear the disappointment in her voice. If only you were here with your friends, he wouldn't have died, and we wouldn't have to be so hurt. This is contrasted in our scripture with Mary, who is clearly angry with Jesus, not coming when she first hears, but staying behind, completely engulfed in her pain and brokenness at all that had occurred. When she does come forth, she shows signs of a deep grief, and I feel much more angrily demands to know why Jesus didn't love them enough to spare them this pain and loss. Lord, if you had only been here, my brother wouldn't have died. As a child, I wondered often why this chapter was included in the Bible. It kind of came off in that time as a rather embarrassing story about Jesus. First, the very idea of raising people from the dead seemed implausible, unbelievable, fantastical, and this idea of Jesus weeping felt almost scripted. Second, for many of us, Jesus seems uncomfortably emotional, and that was definitely true of the younger me. But I think now that the author of John thought it was important to include this story of Lazarus coming back to life, because it isn't just theoretical. And although it can tell us some important truths, about the nature of Jesus, about life and death, about lightness and darkness, about pain and glory. There's more. But it's also not entirely personal. Even to the witness who's writing this, who was most likely there when this drama unfolded, it was most importantly communal. It grounds Jesus not as some supernatural other, but as someone who might have all the knowledge of the world, but is still coming to realize and learn the realities of life and the wisdom that comes from living it. The story here is all about what the earliest readers, and dare I say that all believers, do when they meet grief. Here we are shown vividly what happens when Jesus meets grief. Jesus, and by extension God, knows the pain that we feel, but more importantly, God feels our aloneness when we express it. That Jesus, God, is brought to tears not because we sometimes are mad at God or disappointed in God, but because God knows and feels the responsibility of what it means to live life fully, and knows the pain that has been allowed into the world. And for a God who created us to be relational, there is nothing worse than a feeling that a relationship that is broken, and how desperately alone we can feel in the midst of that. In this moment where suddenly Jesus is both connected to grief of others and alone in his own feelings, potentially of guilt, but certainly of overwhelming sadness at this perceived betrayal and the effects of the choices that he has had. And even knowing what he's about to do, he cannot escape the aloneness of those choices. The aloneness of knowing how his purpose connected to why he had to make the choices he did. Jesus feels alone. Jesus feels broken. He is experiencing how it feels when our relational and sinful natures come into conflict within a community of friends. For him, it is not just the loss of Lazarus, but also the damage that has been done to his friends and his friendships that leads to a feeling of isolation and tears. Christians, we often say that all we need is Jesus. But what Jesus most fully realizes here is that for our humanity created for us and with us with relationship in mind, whom he calls us friends. And when he calls us friends, he cannot choose to minister in isolation. As here, he feels the pain that has been caused, even though he did what he knew had to be done. What this moment shows is that Jesus is realizing even he, God in human form, God with us, needs the connection and love of others to flourish in his God-given identity. May we learn likewise.